2, 1. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Brene Lloyd, and with Northwatch and our February 2016 Nuclear Waste Online webinar series, and we're pleased to have with us this afternoon Shawn-Patrick Stensil, a radiation analyst, nuclear waste analyst a nuclear analyst. I have nuclear waste on my constant agenda. He's a nuclear analyst with Greenpeace Canada. And this afternoon, Shawn-Patrick is going to be walking us through Radiation 101. Many of us have heard presentations from the industry or the regulator on radiation, what it means, and the facts remain the same, but sometimes the interpretation or emphasis is different when we're having that information shared with us through an independent organization like Greenpeace Canada. So thank you, Shawn-Patrick, for sharing this with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brene. Can everyone hear me? Someone just give me a little hello in the chat box. Yes, excellent. Yeah, thank you, Brene. Pleasure to do one of these webinars again, and thank you for organizing it. Full disclosure, I have a cold/flu. So it's good that we're doing this over webinar, so none of you will get sick. But there may be a moment where I break out in a coughing fit. And I'm not firing on all engines today, so I may be a little slow. That said, I'll do my best to get through. So this is meant, with Greenpeace, I also work as a radiation protection advisor. And that's a group of campaigners that we have internationally that have undergone like a basic radiation training of some sort, so that we can assess radiation risks when we're talking to the media, but also when accidents happen like Chernobyl or Fukushima. So I've done a university course in Holland on the basics of radiation, and I've participated in fieldwork in Fukushima and Chernobyl and Palomares in Spain. So I'm not going to be giving you the PhD lesson on radiation. I'll be giving you my layman's take on it. But what I would like to do today for objectives is one, make sure everybody has the same understanding of the terminology. Because as Brene said, we often hear presentations from the industry about radiation, but we often don't understand all the words they're using and what they mean. So I want to get people a common understanding of what those words are. Words like sievert and Becquerel. What does that mean, and how do I look at that? When is it a scary number and when is it not? So first of all, to talk about that, because this is an abstract concept, radiation is invisible and can't be detected. And then after that, I'll take you a little bit into examples of where I guess the debate is, as Renee. My line is now unmuted. Radiation is controversial, and that's partly because we've only learned about it through atomic bomb tests on humans and with Chernobyl and Fukushima. So we'll talk about that a little. So the introduction I want to run you through is fairly simple. Answer the question, radiation, what is it? How do we protect ourselves? How do we measure it? How do we get exposed? And then I'll also talk to you a little bit about Greenpeace's approach. I mentioned we do field work. We have a very precautionary approach to radiation, and I'll give you some examples of that. So first, what is radiation? Well, as you'll hear often in presentations by industry, radiation is everywhere around us, and there's different types of radiation. Sunlight is a form of radiation. Your microwave is a form of radiation. Radio, lower waves like that, is a form of radiation. These are all referred to, though, as non-ionizing radiation. So that's radiation that, as we'll talk about, doesn't break apart other molecules or atoms. What we're going to focus on today is at the left of the screen, what's referred to as ionizing radiation. So that's radiation that can actually disrupt atoms and cells. So it has some big concerns for human health. And into that fall things like x-rays. We get x-rays every day at the dentist, or not every day, but we get x-rays with doctors and dentists. And that has a benefit, but it also has risks. And I always use the analogy of when I was a kid, my mother was more progressive or skeptical, let's say, of what industry said. And she would never let the dentist give me an x-ray every year. But the dentist insisted it was safe to do that all the time when I was a kid. Well, now this.
So we've lost Shawn-Patrick's audio, hopefully temporarily. Shawn-Patrick, if you can let us know, your audio went dead about, so Jan is saying that her audio went dead. Ambrose is speculating on a stalled internet connection. From our end, Shawn-Patrick, it looks like you have muted yourself at your mic, but I did get a message from Shawn-Patrick that his audio, his mic was spinning. His microphone icon is turning. Don't know what that means. Shawn-Patrick, there is an option. You could switch to your phone. I'm assuming that you're coming in on your computer and you could switch to your phone. If you go to, I think you go to more up on the top and you'll see your audio options. If you click down on that, you'll see your audio options. And if you click on that, you'll see the option of coming in by phone. And you just switch to your microphone, use telephone, and it'll give you a number. So that's maybe something you should consider doing at this point, given that we're having trouble with your audio. I'm checking my phone. And some days we have a new mystery, a new webinar mystery. And this is the one. This is the day we're having a not yet experienced mystery. So, Shawn-Patrick, you are unmuted on our end, muted on yours. If you can, I'm going to send you a text message. Apologies, everyone. I'm going to just send him a text message saying, switch to phone. Now, this will not be one of our best recordings, I think. So, thank you everyone for your patience. We're still standing by, trying to restore audio with Shawn-Patrick. If I trusted that I'd had the broadband to do it, the bandwidth to do it, I'd put on some music in the background. while we work on this. At first, I believed that he was muted for a coughing break, but this seems to be going longer. I'm going to just hop over to Skype. Your screen should remain the same. No, I don't think I have the bandwidth to do that. Brene, the tech assistant has asked for you email to log into the account. I don't know. I don't know what that means, but I will go and invite you. For the tech assistant has asked you for email to log into the account. All I can do is go and invite more people and invite you again, Shawn-Patrick. I don't know if that is going to help or not, but I'm doing it. And the invitation was sent. You should not have to log into the account. You should just be in, your invitation should be sufficient. Shawn-Patrick has asked how. I am going to text him and say, can you hear me? Can you hear us? So, okay, thank you, Jim. Audio is good there. So I think it's just Shawn-Patrick. We're not sure if we've lost him altogether. He appears to still be there. I've sent him a text message asking if he, I'll just go ahead and send him a text message saying, so to switch to phone. So we go to more. So Shawn-Patrick, you go to more.
Hi, Bernine, I'm now on the phone.
There you are. Excellent, Shawn-Patrick. Well done.
But I can't see my slideshow anymore.
So are you completely offline?
Any meeting did something.
All right. So can you get your slides up on PowerPoint? Just on
I have
your
them
computer?
in front of me, yeah.
Okay, so just tell me we're on slide 3.
It's no, there, I've got it.
Okay, great. So thank you all for your patience. We're not the smoothest show on the road today, but the content will come to you anyway. So Shawn-Patrick, do you have command of your slides again then?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for your patience. Over to you, Shawn-Patrick.
Yes, another side of how you can't rely for technology on everything. So getting back to the first slide on what is radiation. In this presentation, I'm going to focus in on the left side of the graphic that you see on screen around ionizing radiation. This is radiation where atoms can be broken down, and it's things such as X-rays. I don't know if you heard the analogy I gave before, but when I was a kid, they always wanted you to get an X-ray every year at the dentist, and my mother would refuse, saying it's too risky. And the dentist would disagree. Well, now, of course, they try to discourage you from getting an X-ray every year. So it shows you how our understanding of radiation has been changing over time. So, what is radiation? I like radiation is when you have an unstable nuclei or an atom. That's said to be radioactive. And this unstable nuclei it's unstable. It's giving off energy, and these emissions are what you call radiation. And that unstable atom is trying to become stable again. And what's dangerous, I guess, about ionizing radiation is it lets off enough energy that when it interacts with another atom, it can disrupt the bonds between electrons in that atom, causing damage to it and causing that other atom to become ionized. So if this is happening to your body, of course, that affects you at the cellular level. I like to give the example of, to make it an analogy to people, if you've ever met someone that is projecting a lot of negative energy, there's something wrong, they're agitated, they're trying to become normal again, that's a bit like an atom or an ionized atom. It's a bull in a china shop. It's disrupting things around it, breaking all the china, as it were. And that's why we're concerned about it. And as I said, you have an unstable atom, and that atom is trying to, like all of us, find stability in life and clarity. And what happens through radioactive decay is an isotope will give off energy. It can be a particle, it can be a photon or wave, and this is its way of trying to become stable again. And at each step that it gives off this, it can become other elements. So what you see on screen is uranium-238, and that's the decay chain. And you'll see that uranium, over time, as it gives off different types of radiation, which we'll talk about, becomes different elements. So uranium becomes thorium. Again, it becomes uranium-234 farther on down. It becomes radium. Radon, you'll see about midway down the screen, 222. That's something that shows up in the basements of a lot of Canadian homes, and that's because there's uranium in the rock. So you refer to each of these as a daughter product or a daughter isotope of uranium. And it will go through this decay chain all the way over a long time. I forget how it is. It's billions of years for uranium-238 until it becomes lead again. So that's the process it takes to become stable. And along the way, each one of those is radioactive in some way. It will have a different hazard and also a different chemical hazard. So it's the spontaneous breaking down of nucleus resulting in the release of energy. That is radiation. And these will become different daughter isotopes until it's stable. And as I'll talk about a little later, a Becquerel is a measurement of the amount of radioactivity, and that's equivalent to 1 radioactive decay per second. So you can have some we'll talk about in a half-life where decay happens quite quickly, and others where that decay or instability takes a longer time. So this is where we get into that, as I mentioned, we all know the expression half-life. And that's the amount of time, if you have a volume of a radioactive substance, it takes to have half of that in becquerels. So the rate of decay for a radioisotope. How long does it take to lose half of its strength? And that can range from a very, very short period to billions of years, like uranium. So, for example, after the Fukushima disaster, and Chernobyl, there was the release of iodine-131, and it was in a gaseous form. It has a half-life of about 8 days. So that means that most of that radioisotope will be gone in a relatively short period. After 8 days, half of that activity will be left, and then another half, and then another half. And so, as you can see, it will be eliminated quite quickly. So now, around Chernobyl, iodine-131 is really not a risk. What is a risk is other isotopes that have a much longer half-life and are taking much longer to decay and become stable again. So on screen here, you have a number of different radioisotopes. And showing their different half-lives, how it can vary. So uranium, a half-life of 1 billion years. That's how long it takes to get back to being lead. It occurs naturally in rock. And so in the Canadian Shield, again, as I mentioned, you will see the daughter products of uranium in the basements of Canadian homes as a radon gas, which poses a specific risk that's different than uranium. Cesium-137, I think, is an important one for people to know the name of. That's a longer-lived isotope. It has a half-life of about 30 years. But there was a lot of that released after Fukushima and Chernobyl. So it's this isotope now that is one of the main hazards around Chernobyl and Fukushima. And that's because its half-life is 30 years. So to give an example, Chernobyl occurred 30 years ago this year. That therefore, it's been one half-life has taken place. The amount of cesium has declined by half in 30 years. It's still going to take, however, hundreds of years for it to almost all be gone. So while it was much worse 30 years ago, there has been a decline in this type of radioactivity, which is the principal concern. And then you can see down below, there's things like Moly-99. These are isotopes that are often used in medical facilities as tracers. You'll see they have very short half-lives. So they need to be produced and actually delivered to the hospitals fairly quickly so they can be used, and they disappear quite quickly. So that means they can use them in medical diagnostics, and they'll essentially disappear in a short period, so there's not like a long-lasting threat to the body. So this is where I'd move into different types of radiation. And I think this is important for people. This is an important part for people to understand. Is, as I mentioned before, radiation is waves and it can also be particles. But the type of radiation you're facing or could be facing determines a lot about the hazard and how you would protect yourself from it, for example. And some forms of radiation release particles, like alpha radiation and plutonium, and that can be a very have a huge impact on other atoms and cells. But it's not that it's not a hazard with a great distance, for example. Others, like gamma radiation as a wave, can travel at much farther distances, but maybe absorbed less by cells in the body. So I'm going to walk you through now the three different types of radiations that you most need to be concerned about and understand when you'll be hearing them in public hearings. So on screen, you see alpha, beta, and photon or gamma. These are, I think, the three that I'm going to focus on this call. And they each pose a different hazard to health. And they both pose a different, challenge for how you shield yourself from those types of radiation. Alpha radiation, for example, that is a particle. A large one, like a proton, is released from an atom. Plutonium is an example of this. And the example I always give is I could have an envelope in front of me with plutonium in it. And if the envelope was closed, it would be contained in paper. And theoretically, I could hold that envelope and be protected by the paper. If I opened that envelope and some of that alpha plutonium got on my hands and into my body, it would be very, very, very dangerous because that type of radiation is very destructive at a low range. So the impact it has is only within a few centimeters in air. So you can protect yourself through paper, but if you ingest it, it's very, very dangerous. Another one is beta. So this is where an electron will be emitted from an atom. And that's where it could pass through paper. So it has a different threat than alpha and can impact your tissue. So, for example, after Chernobyl, there were a lot of liquidators, so people that went into the station that were trying to stop the accident, they actually got beta burns. So they were exposed to a lot of beta radiation, and it created burning on their skin. It didn't go deep into their body, but it created burns. And the final one, gamma radiation. So this is the one they always talk about on Spider-Man and misrepresent it. But you'll see that one can pass through paper and can pass through your body as well. So that requires a different type of shielding, such as lead, for example, or water. So you need to know what type of radiation you're dealing with to be able to protect yourself. And it also has an impact on the mechanisms you use to detect it. So if you have a Geiger counter, it may not be appropriate to pick up all of these. So to be very specific, so alpha radiation. This is when you have a very large particle, equivalent to helium, that is emitted from an atom. So with plutonium-240, you can see it releases a helium atom and becomes uranium-236. It's basically the nucleus of an atom that's put out, and that's why it can really break up other atoms when it's in the distance that it travels if it comes in contact. As I mentioned, it has a very short range, only about 10 centimeters in air. So it could be on the table in front of you, but if you're 10 centimeters away, you'd be protected from it. Paper can shield you from it. The primary hazard, though, is through internal exposure. And they can be very damaging to tissue. Around Chernobyl, there was a lot of, especially close to the station, there's a lot of alpha contamination in the area immediately around the plant. Plutonium has a very long half-life, and that's one of the reasons why that area close to the station will probably not be repopulated or shouldn't be repopulated for tens of thousands of years, is because of the contamination of this specific radioisotope. Beta radiation in a similar way. So you see on screen cesium-137. It's small electrically charged particles or electrons that are emitted from the atom, and they can collide with other atoms. But again, it can be shielded by wood, for example, and doesn't go very deep into the skin, so it can cause things like burns. Different hazard, but it can travel farther than alpha radiation. And somebody's saying online, I hope they get into the measures of radioactivity. So I'll start to do that now. Excuse me. As I mentioned, one of the measures of radioactivity is a Becquerel. So this is not about you. This is about the radioactivity. So when you refer to a Becquerel, so if there's a Becquerel is 1 radioactive disintegration per second. So depending on the radioisotopes and their half-life, you'll have a different number of atomic disintegrations per second. And so some, like with uranium, if it has a half-life of 1 billion years, will have, there will be much fewer disintegrations per second. If you have a different radioisotope in a mass with shorter half-lives, you're going to have more disintegrations. So that's referred to as the amount of activity, or becquerels. I think I had a slide out of place. Now jumping over, again, the third type is gamma radiation. And beta decay and alpha decay that we both mentioned, so they both emit particles of some sort from the atom and create daughter isotopes. Usually in these daughter isotopes, there's some remaining energy, so it still feels unstable. And what happens at that point is they release a ray. So it's not a particle, it's a photon, as energy. And that's how it's trying to get down to become more stable again. This, again, it's much less damaging in some ways, but it's a serious threat externally because you can be exposed to it from a long distance. So, for example, in and around Chernobyl and Fukushima, will there be radioactivity on the ground, you can detect what we call ground shine. And so that will be some of this radiation coming off the ground at great distances. So this is the third type, not a particle, but a ray of radiation. And you'll see, I think the thing to keep in mind is you'll see how as different atoms decay into new isotopes, the hazard is different. So an alpha isotope can become a beta isotope, which then again can become a gamma isotope. So that changes the hazard that you're faced with, and you need to keep in mind. So I mentioned becquerels. So that's how you measure the amount of radioactivity in a substance. So it's separate from you and me. The question then becomes, how do we measure radiation impacts on the body? And this is where it's very conceptual, but the way you need to think about it is, remember, isotopes are atoms that have too much energy. They're unstable. They're trying to become stable again. They're letting off energy. Well, why is that energy, a hazard to us? Well, when it's absorbed by the body, it can cause harm. So we need to look at, for each one of those different types of radiation, how much of that energy is actually absorbed by the body. And that then has biological effects that we then must estimate. So this is where it gets somewhat conceptual and really complicated. We're not going to get too far into that. When you're thinking about radiation effects on the body or how it's measured, its impact on the body, it's on how much is being absorbed. And the international measure of that is called a gray, which is 1 joule. I don't remember if you remember from your high school physics class, a joule of energy deposited in 1 kilogram of mass. You don't usually hear grays talked about in public too much, but I wanted to raise it with you. So it's the amount of energy absorbed from the radiation in mass. And then that absorbed dose is measured, what you'll hear most in hearings is the reference of a sievert. So this depends on, there's all these weighting factors that go on, depending on the radioisotope, depending on how it hits you. So the amount of radiation, what kind of radiation, is then converted into how much of it is absorbed by the body as a sievert. So you're going to hear about sieverts in meetings a lot. So 1 sievert is a lot, let's say. So it's a good benchmark. And then what you'll most often hear day to day is around millisieverts, so 0.000, and then microsieverts, so like 6 zeros. And then often background radiation, like if I had my detector with me here in the office, it would probably be in the nanosieverts. That would be, you'd find day to day from background radiation. So here's, in regard to sieverts, so what does it mean? And I think it helps most to see it in context, the levels in proportion to each other, because it's so you can understand it. If you look at the very, very bottom, so this is in millisieverts. So like 1 millisievert is an annual dose due to air travel, for example. Or when you go up in an airplane, you actually get a radioactive dose. Similarly, 1 millisievert is the impact from an X-ray. So that's an additional dose that you would get from 1 X-ray per year. It comes with some benefits, but then there's also risks from that. You'll see a dose from a lung X-ray can be higher, so 10 millisieverts. And then just above that, and this is what you'll often hear in hearings, so what the industry will say and try to compare everything to, is your annual dose, like from background radiation. And that's about, in Canada, it's about 1.8 millisieverts per year. So that's your average. And that changes where you are in the world. But that's what you're getting due to, as I mentioned, the uranium in the rock. We'll talk about this later, from all different sources of natural radiation, that humans, non-anthropogenic radiation. So that's your annual background dose. You'll see, and what the things like the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the States say is they set their limit for additional exposure to the public at about 1 millisievert. So just below that. So what they'll always say is, well, it's the same as the background radiation dose you get. And the thing to keep in mind is background radiation does cause cancer. It's not something we can control, and it has effects. It damages cells. It's something that we've evolved with. But whenever we're adding additional exposure, it increases risk in some way. So this is where they're conflating. It's like saying, oh, it's the same as background arsenic contamination in the environment. You'll see higher up on this list, the higher doses that come with a CAT scan, for example. These are things that you want to avoid day to day. And an important number is 100 millisieverts is the lowest acute dose known to cause cancer. And so that's at a higher level, but that's where they start to see effects around cancer. And below that, it's inferred, but the data is less confirmed, but there's a risk. At higher levels, so at 1 sievert, 1,000 millisieverts, this is where you will start to see signs of radiation sickness if received within a short period. So as I said, 1 sievert is really, really high, and 1 millisievert is background radiation. So it kind of gives you a proportion of where things are at. And then at really high doses that cause death, so I guess Spock on that Star Trek episode where he dies is around 5,000 millisieverts. So much, much higher. You don't get this day to day unless you're in the core of a reactor. So here again, the numbers, the decimal points are very, very important. So be careful about this. A microsievert is a lot less than 1 millisievert, right? So 1,000 microsieverts are 1 millisievert. 1,000,000 microsieverts is 1 sievert. So keep the decimal point in mind when you're talking about these things, because it makes a big difference in terms of what the actual risk is. So I found this actual table on the web last night, and I thought it was a good way to compare things. So we talked about what a Becquerel is. A Becquerel is the amount of radioactivity in a substance. So you have an apple tree. The apple tree, apples are falling down. Nobody's beside that apple tree, so it's just the apple tree is being radioactive. A gray is absorbed dose. So somebody's under the tree. Those apples are having an effect on something. But when we talk about sievert, it's the actual effect on the body. So when we can actually estimate how that absorbed dose is affecting the body and could potentially cause health effects. So these two between Becquerel and sievert are important because one is a substance is radioactivity, and the other is the impact or how much energy is absorbed by you. So here's an example. You have a radioactive substance on a table. You would measure that substance in becquerels. Someone working around that substance would be wanting to measure how much dose they're getting. That would be measured in sieverts by a machine of some sort. So this is the difference between becquerels and sieverts. Touched on this closely or quickly, but as I mentioned, 1 sievert is is really, really high when you start getting signs of radiation sickness. At 100 millisieverts, that's where they see longer-term effects of cancer, and as well on things like fertility. And then in the longer term, what they tend to say is there's deterministic effects, and then they call it stochastic effects, is that for every exposure to radiation you have over a large population, for say 1,000 millisieverts, will increase the risk of cancer by 5% in a large population. So those are done on a probabilistic basis. So you can't say one effect was caused by the other, and that's where you'll get into some interesting discussions on how you do the math in hearings. Sorry, I guess I should speed this up a bit. We're almost through our hour. And this is I want to move into now, like, how do we know about radiation, and how is our knowledge actually limited about our understanding of radiation? And we've known about radiation now for about 200 years, and most of our understanding of it, unfortunately, its impacts on human health came through the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs, unfortunately. And what we had in those instances is two cities in Japan were bombed and exposed to a large, sudden dose of radiation. And they were very large populations. And what they've been able to do, and most of our knowledge around health effects on humans, is based on they tracked the survivors. It was like one big experiment. Is they were able to determine in their studies where people were close to the epicenter of the bomb, make some estimates on what their dose would have been at that place, and then they've been following those survivors throughout their whole lives. And based on that, we have pretty good data on what the longer-term effects are. And those studies are still ongoing, following those survivors. And so that's where our knowledge base comes from. And so the thing to keep in mind is that these people got a fairly high dose and a short dose. And it was a large population, and they had really good data. And one of the things that they saw is that cancer rate doubles when dose doubles, when you get above a certain area. So it was quite statistical. And halves when you cut that dose down. But those were at like higher levels. What we have less information on, and this is where Fukushima and Chernobyl are controversial, is when you have long chronic exposure to radiation. And what has happened is it's called the linear non-threshold theory, is most radiation protection is based on this theory where they've been able to estimate doses, health effects at these high doses, and they've extrapolated down. And that's the basis for setting our standards. And you can see where background radiation is down here at like 1 sievert. So you can see on the ground they had 32,000 bomb survivors. So they had a very large population that they've been able to study. Unfortunately, with Chernobyl and Fukushima, the exposure is very, very different. What you have is larger populations that weren't exposed to one really high dose, but they've been exposed to lower chronic doses over time. And we also don't have very good data. Is the dose estimation of who got what dose in those populations is quite patchy. For example, for Chernobyl survivors, there's huge gaps in the survivors about dose estimation of what dose they got 30 years ago. So what that means is the health studies that have been done are quite controversial. And this is when you're in hearings and there's debates on low dose, the impacts of low dose radiation. It's about this, limitation in our knowledge around, or trustworthy limitation in our knowledge around what the impacts of lower doses and chronic doses of radiation do. So Greenpeace takes a very precautionary approach to this. What you'll hear the industry say is try to minimize the effects. They'll say, we have seen no effects around Chernobyl. We have seen this, this, and this. Or there won't be discernible effects. And that's controversial, one, partly because we have very bad data. They haven't done bad tracking. And the studies aren't really that trustworthy. What I would also put in here that's interesting is that while they haven't been able to get good data on discernible health effects from Fukushima and Chernobyl because of bad data gathering, et cetera, they are seeing impacts of low-dose radiation in animals and fauna around Chernobyl over several generations. So we're seeing some impacts in non-humans after 30 years that are genetic and variations in population size, et cetera. There's a lot of interesting studies that are being done in that area on animals that do indicate low-dose relationships that haven't been confirmed in humans. Usually the industry in hearings doesn't talk about that, though. But it's also, I think, one of the reasons why we need to take a precautionary approach, because we are seeing these impacts in animals and plants over time. So how do we get exposed to radiation? As I mentioned, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a very acute dose. But in your day-to-day lives, you get exposed to radiation in a number of different ways. And right now around Chernobyl and Fukushima, where there's been a lot of radioactive substances released out into the environment, those substances are circulating in the environment, and they find their way into the food chain over time. And that's how you'll end up getting exposed. So it won't be necessarily from the ground shine radiation day to day, but it could be in food. So around Chernobyl, 30 years later, a lot of locals that live in contaminated areas still eat mushrooms, and those mushrooms are bioaccumulating cesium. And so that is an exposure pathway to radiation for those populations. So when you need to think about how you could be exposed, it's in these different ways. So you'll see actually on screen indoor structural radiation. That's an example in Canada where there's an issue with radon, where people are being exposed in their houses in Ontario due to radon. So that's one exposure. And there's also atomic radiation. So you'll see here, this is where you'll often hear the industry talk about different, when they try to equate radiation with background radiation, this is where it tends to come from. 22% of your background radiation dose will actually be medical radiation from X-rays. That can be reduced. There's terrestrial and cosmic and radon, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a graph. I think this is for the U.S. population on exposure to background radiation. You'll see radon is the big one, and that again is coming through. We have basements in North America where people are being exposed to it. You'll see then cosmic and terrestrial, and then there's the man-made radiation sources there, such as medical, nuclear medicine, but then we're still being exposed in some ways through fallout. How do you expose, really quickly, I think we're 5 minutes out, to radiation? Some rules of thumb. The sign, I think you see the sign like it says run. That's the exposure symbol, the triangle on screen. Usually keeping a distance and going behind shielding is generally a good way to protect yourself. So if you come in contact, don't go closer, you go farther away. And then you also need to be very careful about, depending on your situation, on ingestion and inhalation. So for Greenpeace, for example, we've been in situations where we're in radioactive environments, and so there you think very closely about how not to ingest radiation. So that can be wearing gloves, wearing masks, so that you don't get internal exposure to that radiation. So, for example, when I was in Palomares in Spain, where they lost an atomic bomb, I shaved my beard so that radioactive particles would not get stuck in my beard, and I could be properly cleaned. So you do things like that. Similarly, this is just kind of the rules of thumb. You reduce your radiation exposure by the amount of time. So the less time you can be in an area that's radioactive or there's a point source is the best way to reduce your exposure, with distance as well and behind shielding. So in general, the Greenpeace radiation rules that we use, there's no safe radiation dose. Every exposure increases your risk above background radiation. That's what we can control. So we try to minimize radiation exposure wherever possible and limit radiation exposure when Greenpeace does activities. So you need to be able to think about what your possible radiation hazard is. So that goes back to those types of radiation I was talking about. If you're dealing with plutonium, you need to think about how you're going to protect yourself in a very different way than if you're dealing with cesium. So these are important things to keep in mind when you're hearing discussions in media. So with nuclear accidents, there's a lot of talk about emergency planning. That's a great example. Is iodine-131 comes out of a reactor as a gas. It travels really quickly, and you inhale it. You need to protect yourself in a very specific way. And you do that by taking potassium iodide pills, and you need to do it quickly. It doesn't protect you from other radioisotopes, but it protects you from that one hazard and ingestion pathway. So you'll see here on screen, this is where we compare, just for background, where comparing what the public exposure limits set by, say, the CNSC of 100 microsieverts or 1 millisievert per year to what Greenpeace does for if we do activities or things in the field. We try to limit that to a lot less, and comparing it to a dental X-ray, which gives you like 20 microsieverts. And then you'll see nuclear workers. They have a higher dose limit than members of the public at 20 millisieverts. And for background, what's controversial about this right now is in Japan, the public was forced to evacuate areas when the exposure level was about 20 millisieverts. And now they're making people return to areas even if up to 20 millisieverts a year to live. So they're saying you need to go and live in areas where your exposure annually would be the same as a nuclear worker. So they're basically increasing the amount of risk to the public to repopulate those evacuated areas, and this has caused a lot of controversy in those communities. To give you an example, this is me when I had a lot more hair, in front of Chernobyl in 2011. And so here I'm standing in front of the Chernobyl sarcophagus. And the dose rate when I was in front of that sarcophagus was just 12 microsieverts an hour. So I was receiving that much dose in an hour. So it's like less than a dental X-ray, but still high. I would have to stand there for 8 hours to meet the Greenpeace dose limit of 100 microsieverts, and probably about 100 hours to get the public dose limit. So that's where you see the amount of time that you spend in an exposed area can increase your exposure a lot. We had an example in Finland through Greenpeace once where an activist did something they shouldn't have and got a very high dose after just 3 hours, where they went somewhere where they shouldn't have been. So just some real-world examples there. So in summary, now that it's 12:59, radiation is an unstable atom, and it's releasing energy or matter to become stable again. That's the basic concept. The energy that it's releasing can be absorbed by the body, and this is what increases your risk. You need to think about what type of radiation, is it alpha, beta, or gamma, you're dealing with to protect yourself, because that will determine the hazard. And finally, our understanding of radiation effects is really, really limited, so we all need to be precautionary. What we hear in hearings from regulators and from the industry is they'll tend to minimize and say there are no effects. What they're really saying is there's a lot of uncertainty there and we don't know, and it's that uncertainty where they're, I guess, leaving that risk onto the public to try and do their day-to-day tasks. So with that, I'll wrap up. Sorry I'm not in the best of form today, but I think that was okay for firing on a couple engines.
Great. Thank you very much. Off the recording, and we'll move to questions.